Good morning. It's nice to be among you all again on this beautiful Sunday. I know some of you must have felt the way I felt when I first learned about Unitarian Universalism, or UUism for short. John and I were living in Indianapolis, Indiana. We were between churches at the time. And Stephen Fletcher, a colleague of mine at the Indiana Historical Society, invited us to attend All Souls Unitarian Church because he thought the values it taught might resonate with us. And they did. Several weeks later, following some intense discussion, and after we had learned about the 7 principles, now 8, the first thought going through my mind was, all this time I've been a Unitarian without knowing it. That thought happens so frequently to people who discover UUism, especially as adults, that it's almost an inside joke. Some of you, I expect, might leave this morning with a similar thought. I've been a Socinian my whole life and didn't even know it. I believe there's a curious phenomenon that Unitarians, for some reason, often think in threes. For example, we honor William Ellery Channing, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Theodore Parker, a trinity of prophets who influenced the 19th century Unitarian movement. But there is also a trinity of Unitarian prophets who were important in Europe during the 16th century Reformation. As an historian, looking back at those roots and at who we are today, here and now, is exciting to me, and I'd like to share that excitement with you. Several years ago, we viewed in this sanctuary a 6-part film series titled Long Strange Trip, hosted by Ron Cordes. Cordes spoke about our first prophet, Michael Servetus, a Spanish physician and theologian who offended the Pope with his ideas so much that he was imprisoned and condemned to death. After escaping from prison, Servetus inexplicably went to Geneva, where he offended John Calvin so much that Calvin ordered him burned at the stake, along with his damnable books. And so that execution came to pass on October 27th, 1553. He actually had his books strapped to his body, and they burned along with himself. Beyond Servetus, the second prophet was Francis David, leader of the Transylvania Unitarians, who also in the 16th century inspired the first law of religious toleration in Western history. He would ultimately die in jail because of his views. Today, we admire the Transylvania Unitarians in part because they still persist after surviving centuries of persecution. Persecution from the Catholic Church, from the Protestants, from the Romanians who took over their land more than a century ago, from the Nazis in mid-20th century, and still later from communist Russia. 400 years of persecution, and the Unitarians of Transylvania are still proudly declaring their faith. The third name of our Reformation Trinity is that of Faustus Socinus, who led a small Unitarian movement in Poland. His group, however, did not survive centuries of persecution. What did survive, however, was the legacy of freedom and reason in religious thought that has influenced the course of the modern world. In many ways, his movement, which was ultimately destroyed by religious tyranny, had a greater impact on the course of history than any other Unitarian group. Let me prove that. After the Reformation came the Enlightenment, sometimes called the Age of Reason, which gave rise to science and to democratic government. The historian John Herman Randall of Columbia University wrote a classic book on the history of thought through the centuries called The Making of the Modern Mind. When Randall got to the Age of Enlightenment, he mentioned that the rationalist spirit that gave rise to that era, quote, appeared first in the 16th century among the Socinians, the Polish Unitarians. Later on, the guarantee of religious freedom found in our own First Amendment to our Constitution was crafted by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. Both Madison and Jefferson acknowledged they got their ideas from John Locke, the British political philosopher. But Locke, in turn, was influenced in his thinking about religious freedom by the work of Faustus Socinus, whose books were part of his personal library. So this story is both a tragedy and a victory. The tragedy is the violent persecution and eventual extinction of a Polish religious minority in the name of Christianity. The victory is because history has been far more favorable toward the ideas of Socinians than the ideas of those who oppressed them. They lost the battle, but they won the war. Most of us recognize two great names of the Reformation, Martin Luther and John Calvin. They represent what might be called the mainstream protesters. It's misleading to think that their Reformation, however, had much to do with theology. It didn't. Their challenge was to authority, far more than the theology of the Roman Catholic Church. They refused to submit to a church authority they viewed as entirely corrupt. But in terms of theology, there was little difference between what the Reformers thought and what the Catholic Church taught. They all affirmed the doctrine of the Trinity, original sin, the atonement of Jesus, and eternal damnation. What they were seeking then was the reform of political and church authority more than the reform of theology. But a real theological reformation was actually taking place, but in Eastern Europe, where the church's influence wasn't as strong and the rulers were generally more tolerant, in Prussia, Poland, Transylvania, and Hungary. These groups, in varying degrees, challenged not just the authority, but also some of the basic creeds of the church. Now, the Unitarians were a small sect among dozens of other Reformed churches, such as the Anabaptists, the Mennonites, Sabbatarians, Moravians, Hussites, and several others. These groups were diverse in their theologies, and there was no one leader to steer the movement. Historians have labeled them collectively as the radical reformers, because the challenges to the established church were centered on theology as much as political authority. At that time, Western Europe spoke of Eastern Europe as an asylum of heretics, a label of which we today should be proud. Compared with Western Europe, Poland during the mid-1500s was more open to religious diversity. The Catholics, the Calvinists, the Lutherans, and others were all competing for loyalty. A faction within the Reformed Church was beginning to form around the issue of the Trinity, and those who questioned the doctrine came together into common cause. These anti-Trinitarian thinkers called themselves the Minor Reformed Church, and their denial of the Trinity was their distinguishing mark. Historians refer to this group, our forebears, as the Polish Brethren. They would later become known as Socinians. But soon they had another issue, another cause, religious freedom. The various churches joined in a synod to debate different doctrines, such as baptism or the exact nature of Jesus, but they could not reach agreement. Instead, they issued a policy, and this is an important point. They issued a policy that read, "Since in matters of faith, no one in the true church of God may lord it over another, nor be forced, each should enjoy freedom of conscience." In other words, they agreed to disagree. Whatever the outcome of the debates, the Polish Brethren honored the right of dissent within the church, a right they would extend toward all other religious groups as well. No excommunication allowed. That should sound very familiar to us Unitarian Universalists. Not surprisingly, competing groups joined together to denounce the Polish Brethren for their anti-Trinitarianism. Fortunately, the anti-Trinitarians had an ally in the wife of a wealthy landowner who persuaded her Calvinist husband to give land to establish a town where the Polish brethren could practice their beliefs with the guarantee of religious toleration, almost a ghetto. Thus was born in 1570 the town of Rakow, Poland. The town prospered. A university was established that achieved a reputation throughout Europe for academic excellence. A major publishing house turned out writings of the brethren translated into all European languages. 35 years later, after Socinian had come to lead the movement, and people from outside were referring to its doctrine as Socinianism, a visitor from England reported on his experience, saying that when he had, and I quote, taken pains to pass through the town of Rakow, where the heresy of the Socinians flourishes greatly, he felt as though he had been transported to another world. For whereas elsewhere all was full of wars and tumult, there all was quiet. Men and women were modest in behavior, although they were spirited in debate and expert in language, close quote. That was written in 1612, but the initial effort to establish just social policies happened in the 1570s. It was into that setting that Faustus Socinus came to Poland and to Rakow. Socinus was an Italian, born in 1539. He spent his early adult years in Italy as a secretary to Isabella de' Medici. He would eventually leave Italy, traveling first to Switzerland, where he visited various reformers and heretics, and he then traveled to Poland, to the Polish brethren, and there he found a home for the rest of his life. The leadership in Rakow was still very much in disarray. And when Socinus came, he seemed to have both the organizational and theological skills to bring everyone together. His name would forever be identified with the anti-Trinitarian movement, Socinianism. They did not call themselves Socinian, but the rest of the world did. And it became an accusation of heresy. This was the charge against Unitarians when they appeared in England and when they appeared in colonial America, Socinianism. The name itself seemed to the Orthodox to convict anyone of heresy. The Polish brethren in general, and Socinus in particular, were prolific in their writing and publishing. By far the most important and influential work coming from that movement is known as the Rakowian Catechism, because residents of the town of Rakow were called Rakowians. The Catechism is a non-Trinitarian statement of faith that relies on sound reasoning, which meant that they, like other Reformation Christian groups, believed the scriptures to be the ultimate authority. But they added, as others did not, that scripture is always subject to interpretation, and reason is by far the best tool to use to understand scripture. Any interpretation that defies your reason is not the true interpretation. If there were ever a direct line from an historical document more than 400 years old to the UUA of today, which affirms itself as a place where reason and religion meet, this is it. In addition to its Unitarianism and its defense of reason and religion, the Rakowian Catechism denied the doctrine of original sin as unscriptural and irrational. Likewise, the doctrine of atonement is refuted. And Jesus is the path to salvation, it said, not because he died on our behalf, but because he modeled how to live an exemplary life. I don't want to leave the impression that this document and this movement totally represents today's Unitarianism. It doesn't. It does, however, profess certain ideas that we hold dear. The Rakowian Catechism is to modern Unitarianism what the Magna Carta is to modern democracy. The Magna Carta was the first successful attempt to transfer political authority away from the English monarchy to his subjects. The Magna Carta was not at all what we mean today by democracy, but it was an essential step and certainly a like in spirit to modern democracy. Thus, the Rakowian Catechism was the first organized expression of the spirit of Unitarianism as we know that spirit today. It was also among the earliest expressions of the spirit of enlightenment. There are other important legacies in the teaching of the Socinians. Their belief in religious freedom for all. Their belief that the ethical teachings of Jesus are the key to the Gospels, with the Sermon on the Mount as their main scripture, which includes both the Beatitudes and the Lord's Prayer, things like, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You'll recall that one of the sources of the 7 principles, now 8, of UUism are Jewish and Christian teachings that call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. The Socinians also had a keen sense of social justice, giving strong attention to how society treats its people. From here, though, the story takes an appalling turn. The Catholic Church decided to strengthen its hold in Poland, and organized mobs began attacking the dissenting churches in general, but the Polish Brethren in particular. Socinus himself, who spent much of his time in the capital city of Krakow, was physically attacked on the streets more than once by mobs. One time it was a mob of students from the Catholic University who kidnapped him from his sickbed in his Krakow home, dragged him into the streets, beat him, burned his books, then threatened to burn him if he did not recant. He refused. They decided instead to drown him. As they were dragging him to the river, they were confronted by one of the professors who persuaded them not to kill Socinus. This literal Good Samaritan, a Catholic teacher, saved his life. But even despite these episodes of persecution, the Polish Brethren continued to prosper, and Socinus to lead them until his death at age 64. It was after that when religious persecution increased. The Polish tolerance of religions, which up to then was better than in most of Europe, was fragile, and in many ways existed because no one faction dominated politically. That would change when a strong Catholic monarch took charge and decided it was time to purify society and cleanse it of dissenters. Acts of violence increased, not just against Socinians, but against all Protestants. But the Socinians and the town of Raków became a special target in 1638. The Catholic ruling government declared that the university in town would not just close, but its buildings would be destroyed. The printing press of the church would be destroyed, and any books and tracts they could find be burnt. And of course, any churches would likewise be destroyed, and they were. All members of the church were given 4 weeks to leave the town, or they would be executed. The Polish Brethren fled, and many of them went to a town 200 miles away where they tried to rebuild their community. In a few years, they began building a new college and churches, but the decree still held, and they were run out of this town too. All their buildings were again destroyed. In 1658, the Polish Senate decreed that all Socinians in Poland within 2 years must either leave the country, renounce their faith, or be put to death. They were the only Protestant group given this ultimatum. Thus began the diaspora of the Socinians. When the deadline was reached, most of them had already gone into exile. Some went to Transylvania, where they eventually assimilated into the Unitarian community there. Some created a settlement in East Prussia, where the community survived for another decade until a sympathetic ruler died and an unsympathetic ruler, this time a Protestant, took over. They were banished again into exile. The most successful group of all exiles found a welcoming place in Holland, where there existed a strong liberal Christian group called the Remonstrants. They welcomed the small group of Socinian exiles, but within a couple of generations, the remaining Polish Socinians had been assimilated into the Dutch church, and the organized Socinian movement came to an end. What did not disappear, of course, was the influence that this tiny and too often forgotten group had over the course of history. Not just Unitarian, but Western intellectual thought in general. The gift they passed on to us, the place of both reason and freedom of religion, we received intact. It is now ours to protect and pass on. So when we leave today, some of us may leave shaking our heads saying, I've been a Socinian my whole life without knowing it, but now I know. Be it so. Thank you.